Slides.
Looks great.
Pat, thank you. Okay, so I'll begin now. So I'll begin with two quotes, if you will, one quote and one print ad, historical print ad. So slaveholders' intervention in the bodily appearance of their slaves could even extend to expectations about gesture, movement, and general demeanor, how slaves reacted when spoken to, how they walked, where they directed their gaze, whether they appeared content. Though he'd like to be kind to his people, Robert F.W. Alston, a South Carolinian with a great many slaves, declared that he imperatively required of them cheerfulness in their work, wherever and whatever it is, end quote. And the second thing I present to you here, the second document, is an anonymously placed slave sale ad in the Quebec Gazette in 1783 that reads, "A Negro wench about 18 years of age who came lately from New York with the Loyalists. She has had the smallpox. The wench has a good character and is exposed to sale only from the owner, having no use of her at present. Likewise will be disposed of a handsome bay mare. For particulars, inquire of the printer." So I begin this study with two dire and yet sadly commonplace examples of slave owner control. In the first case, we witness how Robert Alston's misperception of his benevolence, his supposed kindness to his people, did not interfere with his belief that his authority rightfully extended not merely to their labor, but their mannerisms and attitudes towards their imposed duties. In the second example, an unnamed white male loyalist who advertised for the sale of an enslaved Black woman after fleeing the newly formed United States of America for Quebec was unafraid to state in print that he had forced her to relocate from New York. While the first quote speaks to the slave owner control of the inner worlds of the enslaved, the latter demonstrates their material hold on the outer worlds. If we consider that resistance as behavior or running away in these cases could result in grave punishment or even death, we must acknowledge that transatlantic slavery was sustained by a web of surveillance, physical brutality, and psychological oppression intended to immobilize the enslaved. Two pervasive forms of control were based upon impeding enslaved access to the written or printed word and the imposition of immobility, passes and fugitive slave ads. Passes were handwritten or typeset pieces of paper bearing the signatures of enslavers, which describe the limits of the legitimate movements of an enslaved person. Carried on their persons, passes were meant to authorize enslaved mobility according to the slave owner's economic and social interests. But their ubiquity, meaning they were everywhere, allowed any white person, regardless of slave ownership, to interfere with the daily movements of any Black person who they suspected of being enslaved, thus helping to conflate Blackness with the legal status of chattel. The second ubiquitous mode of control was harnessed through the technology of the printing press. Mass-produced, widely circulated, and often printed in multiple regions and newspapers simultaneously, enslavers quickly surmised the usefulness of the print culture of slave advertisements to endorse and refine the colonial language of race, which underpinned the systemic exploitations of Black Africans as enslavable. Such advertisements were produced to facilitate both the exchange, the auction and sale, and the recapture, fugitive or runaway slave ads, so two names for the same thing, of the enslaved. While auction and sale notices were typically brief, they were also profoundly dishonest, given that slave owners were loath to disclose evidence of illness, disability, or ongoing patterns of resistance. Fugitive notices, however, tended to be longer and more detailed, shedding light on the visual appearance of the enslaved through descriptions of height, age, build, movement, character, and destination, and dress practices like clothing, hairstyle, and adornment. But they also detailed accents, language, ethnicity, birth origins, and the sophisticated tactics of evasion that enslaved people employ to outwit their physically and psychologically abusive enslavers. Although both depended upon the literacy of the producer, whereas passes endorsed and prescribed the mobility of an enslaved person, fugitive notices literally advertised as illegitimate and illegal the mobility of the so-called slave who had, according to the law, stolen themselves from their owner, thereby inducing the literate public to participate in the person's recapture and imprisonment through the incentive of monetary rewards and the deterrence of legal threats. The nature, intent, and function of fugitive slave ads sheds considerable light on the issues of knowledge production, circulation, and access for enslaved people, as well as the imposed limits of mobility. The social democratization that accompanied the technological advancement of the printing press was not equally accessible or extended to all. In transatlantic slavery, enslavers imposed various strategies of control upon the enslaved, employing terror, physical abuse, psychological coercion, controlling access to food, healthcare, material objects, example, things like clothing and shoes, and implementing prohibitions on what they saw as dangerous African cultural practices and knowledge acquisition. However, the issue of language as a vehicle for knowledge transmission within the context of slavery is complex. On the one hand, European enslavers imposed their languages and place names upon the enslaved, forcing them to speak and understand European languages. While this process must have been an extraordinary source of trauma for the first generations of enslaved African-born people, who typically arrived in the Americas with little to no understanding of European languages, the latter generations, known as Creoles, due to their birth in the Americas, were born into slaving societies where European languages were dominant. For many of these African Americans, meaning continental, their problem was not a lack of European languages, but the gradual transformation or loss of their African languages. Whether or not the enslaved were able to retain their African languages depended on multiple factors beyond their control, like the ratio of African-born people to Creoles, their ability to congregate and practice their cultures without fear or surveillance, and connectedly their access to leisure time, of which archival sources tell us the enslaved typically had none. So here I show you my own research breakdown of the ethnic and birth origin makeup of some enslaved people in the province of Quebec, and this is based on fugitive slave ads. So why I'm pointing this out then is that the African-born people, of course, were in a slave minority context where the majority of other enslaved people were so-called Creoles, meaning born in the Americas. So the African people like Ireland, Joe, Jack, Caleb, and the other person named Jack, how do they maintain their African cultures and languages? Across various empires, it also became typical for whites to saddle the enslaved with first names, which recalled their European homelands and birthplaces, or places of birth. Two striking examples of this can be found in fugitive slave ads placed in Nova Scotia and Quebec for Black enslaved men called Belfast and Ireland. In this way, European place names and other naming practices became another symbolic mark of ownership and a way to deny the enslaved population the ability to control their identities. On the other hand, while it was common to prohibit or restrict African cultural, religious, and musical practices, enslavers also almost universally forbid the enslaved from learning to read and write. If knowledge, as the understanding of a shipping timetable, a bill of impending slave sale, the description of a slave rebellion, or the location of a storehouse of arms was was power, then the enslaved were to be summarily blocked from accessing such potential. These strategic attempts to block the enslaved from gaining literacy were a way of controlling Black mobility, and with it, access to the information, ideas, and intellectual transformation that would allow a group legally defined and socially stigmatized as chattel to assert their humanity. However, despite these barriers, the perpetual white underestimation of Black intellect and the clandestine practice of Black resistance, as well as prolific white dependence on enslaved Black domestic labor, meant that some Black people came to master European languages both through speech and through reading and writing. Arguably, enslaved mobility was indelibly linked to intellectual transformation. Since for enslaved Blacks, literacy was an essential component of resistance through flight. Or, as Ishmael Reed has put it, quote, the slave who was the first to learn to read and write was the first to run away, end quote. In what follows, I adopt an extended conceptualization of creolization. The transformation, and this term means the transformation of cultures, societies, and populations within the context of the contact between Europeans, enslaved Africans, and colonized and enslaved Indigenous people in the Americas, to explore the intersection of and conflicts between knowledge production and enslaved mobility. So in doing so, I seek to interrogate the too easy alignment between European Enlightenment thought and the democratization of knowledge systems for society at large. The Western stratification of knowledge was undergirded by a concurrent stratification of mobility and the imperial theft and repurposing of indigenous knowledge in Africa and the Americas. In the early modern period, Europeans did not define volitional movement as a human right. Or put another way, people that Europeans deemed to be their racial inferiors and sometimes not human at all, in their worldview, had no claim to self-directed movement. Rather, one's ability to move about freely in the world without threat of social or physical harm was determined by markers of identity like race, gender, sex, sexuality, and class. Within the context of transatlantic slavery, this meant that elite whites sailed to Africa and the Americas as settlers and tourists. Economically disenfranchised whites, typically those of marginalized ethnic or national origins, as indentured servants, and enslaved Black Africans as inhumanely tight-packed cargoes in the bowels of slave ships with an insurance value on their heads. So here's actually an abolitionist or anti-slavery rendering of the cargo hold of a slave ship, and every Black mark you see is actually representing an enslaved human being in the cargo hold. And this process was called tight packing, and this is a visual representation of tight packing. What countless Europeans came to see, experience, and document through personal and business journals and printed spreadsheets and ledgers as they sailed along each leg of the globalizing transatlantic enterprise, enslaved Blacks would eventually understand only in a piecemeal fashion as they were forcibly disembarked on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean and sold to the highest bidder. Therefore, it was not just the experience of the transatlantic transits, which were dramatically unequal, but for the African, access to the knowledge about why, by whom, to where, and for what purpose they were being forcibly removed from Africa. Across the Americas, the enforced and often violent intimacies of slavery propelled the enslaved into close proximity with whites, in whose homes and on whose properties they were forced to live. While this proximity facilitated surveillance and a violent white drive towards enslaved anti-knowledge, it also created the movement toward what I would like to call a creolized counter-knowledge, a product of individual and collective resistance that was an essential component of Black survival. To the extent that creolization for the enslaved was always experienced under duress, the limits and nature of the knowledge that enslaved Blacks were able to acquire were also a product of their ongoing navigation of the institutional violence of slavery. However, although the widespread experience of enslaved resistance across temperate, tropical, and semi-tropical regions indicates that such counter-knowledge was commonplace, because its manifestations in things like enslaved literacy were also literally illegal, it is often difficult to recuperate. However, the very fugitive slave advertisements, which were created through the assertion of white economic, cultural, and technological dominance, Due to the determination of the enslavers to recuperate their lost so-called property and the unrelenting resistance of the enslaved for their freedom, also became frequent sites of the representation of the creolized counter-knowledge of the enslaved Black communities, demonstrating their awareness and analysis of and insights into white behavior, customs, society, and technology. Similarly, to the extent that passes were forged and not just stolen, and networks of counterfeiters emerged to illegally produce documents that usurped the authority of white enslavers, the unauthorized passes used by the enslaved were also a product of this counter knowledge that was originally intended to defeat enslaved mobility. This counter knowledge was also the how of enslaved escape, how escapes were actually enacted, which often related to the evidence of the precursory Black surveillance of white individuals and communities and evidence of sophisticated planning and delayed mobility. The central genre of knowledge production that I will interrogate is the routinized printing of fugitive slave advertisements. The knowledge produced in these ads was not only deliberately partial and biased, but generative of violent, even lethal encounters between the freedom-seeking enslaved people and the white population or state-sanctioned agents like jail keepers and sheriffs who hunted them. The language of Canadian ads highlights the extent to which enslavers compelled the reading public to accost and stop Black people. Printed by Hugh Kirkman, a loyalist from South Carolina in 1783, you see the ad here, notice for a missing Black man. He described him as, quote, a small, well-looking Negro boy named Peter, about 17 years of age. The notice informed the public that, quote, if he is stripped, he has his country marks on his back in the form of a square thus, end quote. Country marks was the term used by white enslavers to describe African scarification, the self and community created bodily marks commonly associated with ethnicity and rites of passage. Therefore, Kirkham's suggestion that Peter be stripped encouraged the public to manhandle, disrobe, and inspect Peter in order to verify his identity by examining his scarification. I will examine printed and manuscript sources which demonstrate the ways in which white enslavers sought to control the mobility of enslaved and free Blacks in Canada. I will then pursue two biographical case studies which will analyze certain fugitive slave ads that documented the strategies of escape and evasion, or that demonstrate evidence of Black access to literacy or to allies willing to use their literacy to aid the enslaved and expand the terrain of their self-directed mobility. These sources often revealed that the enslaved were clearly also counter-surveilling their enslavers, aware of their broader communities, and even when illiterate, able to tap into other communicative networks to fight for their freedom. Little is known about Canadian slavery, both inside and outside of the nation. The small scale of the field of Canadian slavery studies is not a byproduct of an archival deficit, though, but rather a deep-seated hypocrisy and a national amnesia. Canadians are not well trained in a knowledge of the nation's colonial origins and histories. Under two European empires, Britain and France, at any stage of our educations from elementary school to university. Unlike the USA, where one could argue that the average American has a basic understanding of slavery as it transpired in their nation, although admittedly, almost exclusively in the South, the average Canadian has no idea that transatlantic slavery transpired in Canada, let alone what it actually looked like. I use the term hypocrisy because Canadians have deliberately used the study and veneration of the Underground Railroad as a 19th century stand-in to obscure and obliterate their two-century participation in slavery. So from the 1600s until 1834 is when it was abolished in what would become Canada. Instead, they have celebrated typically during Black History Month, February in Canada and the USA, the 31-year period when enslaved Blacks in the USA fled north to Canada across what would become the Canada-US border to freedom due to the earlier abolition of slavery in the British Empire. The date again is 1834, of which Canada had remained a loyal part. So since the USA did not end slavery until the termination of its Civil War in 1865, during these 31 years, 1834 to 1865, crossing the northern border literally meant crossing into freedom. This celebration of Canadians as abolitionists, however, denies the evidence of the systemic, cultural, and informal racism that greeted the fleeing Black people, the African Americans and Africans, when they arrived, and obscures the histories of the north to south flights of enslaved Blacks who ran from Canada to escape their enslavers prior to 1834. In terms of the regional scope of slavery in Canada, it transpired across 6 of the 10 provinces, from central Canada eastward, including Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, including Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. Unlike tropical and semi-tropical regions in the Americas, where plantation agriculture was a central economic engine, slavery in Canada became a decidedly urban enterprise. For instance, through his collection and analysis of slave sale and fugitive slave ads in the British province of Quebec from 1760 forward, Frank Mackey has determined that enslaved people lived primarily in Quebec City, then Montreal, then elsewhere in the province. The labors of enslaved females and males alike were often a mix of domestic and outdoor duties, frequently described as town and country housework. Since the Canadian climate prohibited an all-year agricultural economy, the tropical plantation model was unsustainable, and connectedly, a smaller population of people were enslaved in the region, making it typical for 1 or 2 people to be held in bondage within the same residence. Indeed, what became normal was white people who simultaneously enslaved Black people and employed indentured servants, often leading to cross-racial collaboration and allyship as people teamed up to flee from abuse meted out by enslavers and employers. And that's what you see here with mulatto. That's a term for a mixed race man of African and European descent. Tom fleeing along with a carpenter, Richard Sutton. And we know that Richard is white because he's not named as white. So as in other parts of the Americas, white enslavers gave little thought to the separation of Black families and frequently compelled the movement of enslaved people across what later became the Canada-US border. So central to the proper function of slavery was the ability of enslavers to control the mobility of those they enslaved. This manifested in different ways and at different moments in an enslaved person's life. Transatlantic slavery in its entirety was premised upon the expropriation of millions of Africans, a centuries-long act of terror and brutality spanning 400 years. Although 12 million captive Africans survived the slave ships to be scattered across the Americas, creating the Black diaspora, another 9 million died prematurely. Approximately 7 million died during the marches to the West African coast, and another 2 million died at sea. But the ongoing trade and exchange of enslaved people in the Americas meant that they were vulnerable to relocation at the whim of their enslavers. Whites also forced the enslaved to travel through a process of rental. So they rented out the enslaved people, through which they profited, the enslaver, from the sale of their skills and labor. However, slave rental sometimes allowed the enslaved to evade the surveillance of their slave owners altogether, providing opportunities for escape. There's significant evidence that white enslavers in Canada thought little about the pain and suffering they inflicted upon the enslaved through control of their mobility. Through both legal and illegal means, whites prioritized their own personal and social interests above the basic comfort, dignity, and humanity of those they held in bondage. Black social and familial connections were not deemed to be relevant in the economic calculations, which often governed these decisions. As my second opening quote attests, certain cataclysmic events like wars precipitated great upheavals in the lives of the enslaved due to the migrations of their enslavers. During the Revolutionary War, several British colonial officials issued proclamations incentivizing the enslaved to abandon their white revolutionary slave holders and cross to British lines. However, it is also true that the same men called upon whites loyal to Britain to flee north into Canada, encouraging them to bring their enslaved people and servants with them. This white repopulation began in Nova Scotia prior to the war, when Governor Charles Lawrence offered newly confiscated lands to New Englanders, willing to move north. His scheme worked, and between 1760 and 1774, an estimated 8,000 New Englanders from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, places familiar with Anglo-American practices of slaveholding, moved north into Nova Scotia. Furthermore, Harvey Amani Whitfield contends that Nova Scotia's government offered the New England settlers more land if they brought enslaved people north to the region. British colonial officials also used their authority to control the mobility of those they enslaved for personal gain. In the 1780s, John Wentworth, then Surveyor General of the King's Woods in North America, later appointed the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia in 1791, retained 2 enslaved people for himself, Matthew and Susanna, and sent a sizable group of 19 enslaved people from Halifax to Suriname. At the time, it was known as Dutch Guiana. As Wentworth described, they were all, quote, American-born and well-seasoned, perfectly stout, healthy, sober, orderly, industrious, and obedient, end quote. In a regretful tone, he then went on to explain that he could not free them and instead wished to be assured of their humane treatment, which he deemed a favor that the purchaser could bestow upon him. Wentworth's description continued by mentioning their Christianity, their skills, their health, and their potential fertility. While Wentworth's letter would have helped the enslaver to orient their new so-called property within the configuration of their perhaps unfamiliar tropical labor regime, we are left to wonder about what became of these 19 people in their new lives, far away from Matthew and Susanna, who had been left behind in Nova Scotia. The mobility of enslaved people was also controlled through their individual or group sales by common white citizens. Both enslaved and free Black men were an essential part of the shipbuilding labor force in Nova Scotia. The skills of Black male artisans, abilities which made them both economically valuable and socially vulnerable, were highlighted in a slave sale notice printed in the fall of 1715 in Boston, Massachusetts. 1751 in Boston, Massachusetts. The 30th of September edition of the Boston Evening Post included a slave sale notice from Benjamin Hallowell, which boasted, quote, just arrived from Halifax and to be sold 10 hardy, strong Negro men, mostly tradesmen, such as caulkers, carpenters, sailmakers, and rope makers, end quote. The forced removal of these 10 men from their homes in Halifax would not have included the relocation of loved ones or kin, who, if enslaved, would not have had the power to make such decisions for themselves. Furthermore, as was common, since the notice did not insist upon a joint sale, there's a strong possibility that the men were separated and sold to different buyers in Boston or further afield. Their forced alienation from Nova Scotia was most likely exacerbated by a further separation from each other. Black children were also not immune from such cross-border sales. On April 29, 1768, a letter written by the enterprising founders of the Quebec Gazette newspaper, founded in 1763, William Brown and Thomas Gilmore, detailed their plan to purchase an enslaved child from the 13 colonies. Written to their mentor, William Dunlop, the Postmaster General of Philadelphia, the pair expressed their frustration with a labor retention problem. Since the French-Canadian servants, whom they described as intolerable insolent, would not engage for any considerable time, the business duo decided to force these duties of the printing office upon someone who could never leave, an enslaved child. As the letter explained, quote, we are at last come to a resolution of trying to get a Negro boy, wherefore we beg you will endeavor to purchase one for us, end quote. Disturbingly, the letter reads like an order for a commodity and not a request to purchase and forcibly relocate a human being. They specified that they wanted a boy between 15 and 20 years of age, fit to put to press, meaning the printing press, and who has had the smallpox and is country born and can be recommended for his honesty. While the mention of smallpox demonstrates their interest in the health of the child and his ability to survive the next epidemic, the term country born indicates that they, like Wentworth, were invested in the idea that Black enslaved Creoles, meaning people born in the Americas again, were less resistant or more obedient than their African-born counterparts. Black children, like adults, were also at risk from kidnappers looking to sell them into slavery. Pervasive racism and the conflation of Blackness with the status of the slave meant that this fate could befall Black people regardless of whether or not they were free or enslaved. It is believed that the white Liverpool, Nova Scotia resident Zebulon Perkins purchased the employment contract of an indentured Black child from John Stewart around the 1790s. However, a letter from a grand jury to the magistrates of Queens County revealed that Perkins was accused of deporting the child to the Caribbean island of Antigua, where he supposedly sold the remaining time on the contract to a local business owner. Expressing concern for their own business interests and not at all for the grieving Black parents or the terrified Black child, the white citizens on the grand jury framed their arguments for curtailing Perkins's illegal actions in strictly economic and practical terms. So part of their letter read, "Gentlemen, the grand jury earnestly requests the worshipful bench would write to the justices in Liverpool for confirmation on this subject, as a transaction of this nature, independent of its illegality, if overlooked, will be productive of much injury to the community in preventing Negroes from binding out their children in the future." So in preventing Black free adults from giving over their children, writing up, allowing them to enter into an indentureship contracts in the future with white employers. In the wake of the Black child's forcible removal, some 3,000 kilometers to the Caribbean island of Antigua, the failure of the grand jury members to mention the names of the Black child or his parents highlights the stark commodification of free Black labor and the utter irrelevance of Black suffering for white Nova Scotians. So my first case study. So on the 3rd of May, 1767, a man named Andrew, described as a mulatto Negro slave, was listed in a fugitive slave advertisement in the Quebec Gazette. According to James Crofton, a Montreal vintner and slave owner who arranged for the notice to be printed, the 23-year-old had been born in Maryland. According to Crofton, also, Andrew's dress practices, including the African tradition of head wrapping, the tying of cloth around the head for warmth, sun protection, sweat absorption, or to disguise lice or other infections, or to style and beautify the body. The ad stated, quote, "He is remarkable for being clean dressed and wearing a handkerchief tied around his head." Crofton's advertisement also detailed what he described as Andrew's familiarity to some of the white gentlemen of Quebec City and Montreal, a familiarity brought on, at least in part, by the mobility that Crofton forced upon Andrew. The notice revealed that in the summer of 1766, Andrew had been rented to a Montreal merchant named Mr. Joseph Howard for 3 months. Furthermore, although Crofton resided in Montreal, his placement of the notice in the Quebec City newspaper, which is 250 kilometers away from Montreal, indicates that he relied upon a network of like-minded whites to inform on or even catch Andrew, like the merchant Henry Boone in Quebec City, who he names in the ad. Clearly, too, Crofton may have suspected that Andrew had reason to head to Quebec City. Similarly, Crofton's mention of Andrew's Maryland origins was a way to flag for readers that Andrew may have been trying to return to the region from which he had been forcibly removed from community and kin. While Crofton's disclosure of Andrew's Maryland origins may have also been designed to apprise readers of the nature of Andrew's accent, Crofton went further, detailing the languages which Andrew had acquired, stating that he, quote, "speaks good English, French, a little Dutch, and Ursi." While English and French were commonly spoken in Quebec, Dutch and Ursi were not. And Andrew's knowledge prompts the contemplation of his path of language acquisition through travels and or previous enslavers who had compelled him to learn them, or other communities in which their knowledge proved useful. But Crofton's notice also provided details that indicate that Andrew's escape was not a last-minute or impromptu affair, but meticulously planned. The ad also states that Andrew, quote, is supposed to have with him forged certificates of his freedom and passes. As mentioned above, passes were pieces of paper given to the enslaved by the enslavers to endorse their mobility within certain parameters and for certain reasons. Often authenticated with the enslaver's name and signature, they were meant to be carried by the enslaved person when traveling. As such, the existence and use of the documents established an ideological and social framework that positioned the enslaved as subjects of surveillance to be immobilized within certain regions. The commonality and nature of the passes and their use as evidence of enslaver authority over enslaved mobility and immobility, meant that other white people understood their ability to demand that any Black person who they suspected of being a slave produce a pass to verify that they had been granted the ability to travel through a certain region. At the same time, the ubiquitous circulation of fugitive slave ads that incentivized white alliances with enslavers with promises of rewards and threats of legal prosecution emboldened whites to know that they could indiscriminately stop, manhandle, search, strip, and incarcerate Black people if they suspected them of unauthorized mobility. As I have already mentioned above, some fugitive slave notices like Kirkham stated this explicitly. If correct, Crofton's suspicions that Andrew possessed both certificates of freedom and passes alerts us to at least two potential strategies of escape. Possessing certificates of freedom would indicate that Andrew planned to claim that he had been manumitted, meaning set free by Crofton legally, and therefore, as a legally free person, had the right of volitional movement. But the passes indicate that Andrew, seemingly well known in the two biggest settlements of the province, Montreal and Quebec City, did not necessarily intend to escape by impersonating a free man, but instead by embodying his identity as an enslaved man, one with the permission of his enslaver to move freely both within the province and across provincial borders. Excuse me. While the first tactic necessitated that Andrew shed his visible identity as this thing called a slave and perform freedom in convincing ways, the second one would have allowed him to be himself or some version of the Black male enslaved identity that Crofton and his fellow white citizens expected him to be. It is in this way that Andrew would have escaped detection, not by performing freedom, but by deceiving whites by performing within their diminished expectations of Black bondage. So almost a quarter of a century later, another Quebec enslaver named Judah Joseph was hunting an enslaved Black woman in print. According to the ad placed on the 20th of July, 1791, in the Quebec Gazette, Chloe was a Black woman of about 30 years of age. Unlike Andrew, who was enslaved in Montreal, Chloe's isolation within the slave minority colony of Quebec must have been further exacerbated by Joseph's residence in the small community of Berthier, Quebec. Berthier is situated on the north side of the St. Lawrence River between Montreal and Quebec City, about 80 kilometers northeast of Montreal and 191 kilometers southwest of Quebec City. Using typical sexualizing and demeaning language, Joseph described Chloe not as a Black woman, but as a Negro wench. And wench was a term used in the 18th century and 19th century to mean a woman of loose morality or a sexually lascivious woman. And you see it constantly used in place of the term woman when paired with Negro or Black in describing enslaved Black females. The latter term commonly, so, okay, I'll tell you that. Let me see here. So Joseph's notice was extraordinary for the ways that he detailed the how of Chloe's escape an act which ironically publicly undercut his role as a competent slave owner in several ways. Describing her as stout and bilingual, speaking English and French, Joseph also explained that Chloe had orchestrated a rather daring nighttime escape on the 13th of July. The ad stated, quote, she got out of the garret window by the help of a ladder, but also that she, quote, is supposed to have gone off in a canoe with a man of low stature and dark complexion who speaks English, Dutch, and French, end quote. Both disclosures are worthy of close consideration Both disclosures are worthy of close consideration. Now, since a garret is an attic, typically with a sloping ceiling, Chloe's escape with a ladder through a window informs us that she was likely made to work and or reside within Joseph's home and perhaps forced to sleep in the attic. If the attic was not where she slept, then we can still surmise that it was a space to which she had access, was not necessarily closely monitored, and a place within which she could escape detection. Chloe's use of a ladder conveys a sense of the scale of Joseph's residence. Since attics are typically above the upper floor of a house, Chloe's need for a ladder makes sense in terms of the distance she had to move from the attic to the ground when exiting the window. Furthermore, Joseph's description of her as not tall suggests that the distance was too far for her to safely jump. But Chloe's use of the ladder is essential for another reason, for our understanding of the nature of her escape in another way. Did Joseph learn of how she escaped because Chloe fled so quickly that she failed to remove the ladder after climbing down to freedom? Or once Joseph had determined that Chloe had fled, did he understand that her only way out of his residence was through the window? Perhaps because he had incarcerated her in the attic, or because any other path out of the home would have been one by which he would have been alerted to her movements. What seems certain is that Chloe or an ally was able to place the ladder at the appropriate spot of the residence to facilitate her escape, but to do so at a time when Joseph did not immediately detect it. Alternatively, if the ladder could be bundled up like one made of rope, Chloe was able to hide it in the attic undetected until she was ready to use it. Was the ladder Joseph's property, or that perhaps of the unidentified man in the canoe? It is, of course, impossible to know, but Joseph's choice of the words in his disclosure, quote, she is supposed to have gone off, indicate that he was relating not what he himself had seen, but what some informant had later related to him. Therefore, as much as the notice is a testament to how Chloe outsmarted Joseph with a sophisticated planned escape, Joseph's wording also reveals his access to details of Chloe's escape that were not derived from what he had directly witnessed. Rather, Joseph's knowledge of the man in the canoe seems to have come from at least one other person and stands as another example of white enslaver networks of knowledge production and circulation designed to stifle the resistance of enslaved people like Chloe. We should also question why Joseph placed the ad in the Quebec Gazette and not the Montreal Gazette or the Montreal Herald, the two other newspapers which were operating in the closer urban settlement to Berthier. Did he for some reason suspect that Chloe's unnamed ally had rowed the pair towards Quebec City, and if so, why? However, it is also striking to consider what Joseph clearly was unable to discern. His description of Chloe's ally is simultaneously detailed and incredibly lacking. Although we are informed that the man in question was trilingual, small in stature, and had a dark complexion, Joseph clearly did not know his age, his name, place of residence, or race, things that he most certainly would have printed to assist in Chloe's recapture. Furthermore, the fugitive notices for white men fleeing from jails like criminals, merchant ships like sailors, military like soldiers, and employers like indentured servants reveal that whites in 18th century Canada used terms like brown, black, and dark to describe the complexions of other white people. So as such, the phrase dark complexion was not a secure race-specific term at this moment in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada. The details that Joseph printed ironically work against the pervasive racial ideology that justified the universal enslavement of Black Africans by describing Chloe's escape in a way that clearly demonstrated the intelligence, forethought, and sophisticated planning employed in her perfectly orchestrated escape from the upper floor of his residence. Although we do not know who aided Chloe, again, because Joseph did not know, she clearly had a male ally who either owned, borrowed, or stole a canoe, and who was willing to risk his own safety to assist her. Joseph's temporal framing of Chloe's escape within the one night of July 13th and his claim that she had gone off in the canoe would indicate that the man was waiting for Chloe. Connectedly, although we cannot know how this communication occurred, spoken, written, or with some go-between, this tells us that Chloe must have been able to convey her desire for escape and confirm her plan with her ally prior to the night of July 13th. Ironically, then, Joseph shared powerful details of Chloe's counter surveillance of him and his household, the knowledge of which had allowed Chloe to escape. So in conclusion, transatlantic slavery was unique in its horror because it defined the slave as a thing, chattel under the law, movable personal property like the chairs we're sitting on, the desks or tables in front of us. Enslaved people suffered physical brutality, terror, material deprivation, and domestic and community surveillance designed to indoctrinate them into a belief in their supposed racial inferiority. By instilling the idea of inferiority in the slave community, enslavers hoped to elicit self and community policing. To be a slave then meant that you had no control over yourself, your life, that of your community, or your kin. Enslavers controlled every aspect of the enslaved, of the lives of the people they enslaved, including the nature, location, duration of their labor, their diets, their clothing, their language, and their cultural practices. The imposition of a matrilineal order meant that enslavers also owned at birth any children born to their enslaved females, regardless of the race or social status of the child's father. As I've discussed throughout, another thing over which enslavers exerted jealous, even violent control was the mobility of the enslaved. Since slavery was a fundamental economic imperative, or slavery had a fundamental economic imperative, dictating where an enslaved person was, why they were there, and when they would return was a means of controlling their labor and its monetary rewards, which the enslavers unilaterally stole. But the desire of enslavers to control the movements of the enslaved also demonstrates their pervasive fear of enslaved resistance as flight or running away. As a fugitive slave ad's place for Andrew and Chloe demonstrate, enslavers had reason to be afraid. Crofton's accusation that Andrew possessed certificates of freedom and passes clearly reveals his suspicion that Andrew was literate or had gained access to literate allies who were willing to aid him in his escape. Meanwhile, Joseph's description of Chloe's daring nighttime escape through an upper floor window of his residence and into a waiting canoe demonstrated her intelligence in undertaking the complex plan. Both notices reveal the creolized counter-knowledge of the enslaved in Quebec. In Andrew's case, the central role of literacy, theft of documents, or perhaps forgeries alerts us to a network within the region that was willing to aid the enslaved in their escapes, whether for selfish personal gain or for justice, by producing or securing the necessary documents for them to extend their mobility, either through false declarations of the enslaver's authority or documents that represented them as free people. In Chloe's case, it was her knowledge of the latter, as well as Joseph's home and schedule, which allowed her to escape from the upper floor of his residence, initially undetected. But her identified male ally also reveals an escape plan of extended duration, since it implies that she alerted him to her plan ahead of time to allow him to secure the canoe and to know when and where to collect her. Therefore, in spite of the clear evidence of the devastating abuse of enslaved and free Black people by white enslavers and employers in Canada through the strategic control of their mobility, undoubtedly, there's also indisputable evidence of Black free and enslaved people building networks, calling upon allies, and using their intelligence, skills, talent, ingenuity, and perseverance to outmaneuver their oppressors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nelson. And I'm now going to moderate questions, and got my panel up that will show when hands are up. If anyone wishes to ask a question, if you could put your hand up. You put just a moment to digest what you said.
For sure.
Yeah, such a such a complex and compelling story of a dark time, and the light, if you like, that that does come out and reflect from the resistance of enslaved peoples, the successful resistance they've been searching for. It's a very powerful story. I see Scott McMillan's hand. Scott, let's see, can you unmute him, Patrick? If he's muted.
Go ahead, Scott. You're good to go.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. That was an incredibly powerful talk. Right? It was. Is this taught in today's school system to young people?
Right. Oh, thank you, Scott. And thank you for being here, Scott, and everyone for joining in today. I know you could be doing many, many other things. Thank you for that question, Scott. To my knowledge, no. And my point of reference is I taught at McGill for 17 years, and I taught an undergrad class, lecture class called The Visual Culture of Slavery, because I come at this through the lens of an art historian who's looking at the visual culture that was created across the 400 years. So I typically had about 80 to 100 students in that class. And of course, about 75, 80% of them were Canadian. And I started the class by saying, who comes to the class with a knowledge of, transatlantic slavery in general? And almost everybody's points of reference were either the American South or the Caribbean. And then my next question is, who comes to the class with knowledge of Canadian slavery? And in those 17 years, Scott, I had one student say yes. And when I asked that student, could you please share with us any of the content that you were taught? There was no content. The student was given one sentence, by the way, slavery also existed in Canada. And the teacher proceeded to teach them about a tropical or semi-tropical location. Of course, that's not the teacher's fault, because how do the teachers know how to teach this if they were never taught this? So part of, I think what you're probably getting at, Scott, too, is that there's only a handful of people like myself, James Walker, Harvey Manny Whitfield, et cetera, who are scholars, not just of transatlantic slavery, but of Canadian slavery, who are employed in Canada or elsewhere, who can teach a class like this at the university level. And it's people like us, really, who will train that student who will go on to write curriculum for the grade 8 class or the grade 11 class. So if we're not in place, then where are the teachers who will be skilled at being able to bring this and make it legible for children in elementary schools and high schools? So sadly, the answer is today, no. So I think what's going on across Canada at the moment, being African History Month or Black History Month, is that, again, most teachers trying to give content are teaching the Underground Railroad, right? And that's what I'm saying is our Canadian amnesia and our Canadian hypocrisy, because the Underground Railroad, again, was 31 years and Canadian slavery was 200. Thank you, Scott.
Gail McDonald. Is Gail unmuted?
Stand by. Is a hand up?
I don't see your hand anymore. Let me move to Michelle Forrest.
That'd be really helpful.
Yeah, let me move to Michelle Forrest.
There we go.
Gail's back. I'll stay with Gail and then move to Michelle. Gail,
you were able to unmute now.
Oh dear. Gail's hand has disappeared again. I'm going to call on Michelle and see if.
Okay, there I can see. I can see. I had to unmute myself. Is that okay?
Okay, absolutely.
Moving on.
Gail,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you for everyone who's trying to help me. I'm pathetic when it comes to technology. I was very impressed with the movement of your slides, Dr. Nelson.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, it's hard won, this knowledge.
Oh, tell me about it. Recent knowledge on my part too, Gail. So I'm with you.
I was just going to say that my first introduction to the level of Nova Scotia's involvement has come from individuals that are at DAL, individuals that are teaching at DAL, various people around the African Canadian community in Halifax. But I have to confess that this past summer was my first foray to the Black Loyalist Museum in Shelburne.
Okay.
And that is one of the best documented of history of the level of enslavement, and it is now the basis for my understanding of why people went back to Sierra Leone.
Right.
The promises that have been made by the British. And I grew up in Nova Scotia. I haven't always lived here, but I grew up in Cape Breton as well. And I made a note of that, your note about Cape Breton, because I never heard anything about this growing up. I've had to educate myself since then.
Right.
But I can't commend enough the Black Heritage Museum. Some of the pictorial images that you've had are also displayed there. And I was there for an hour and a half. I didn't know this place would be so large or so involved. I need to go back and spend about 3 hours there to really take in the level of the knowledge. So I would encourage anyone who hasn't been there to make that trip at some point. But I really want to thank you for giving the text of surveillance here.
Right.
That it's not only visual, it's actually in print. It was able to be, I mean, it's astounding that it was put in the public record, the level of surveillance and the arrogance of it. The simple, not only the atrocity of it, but the arrogance. Anyway, I've got so much more to say, but I know Michelle wants to talk, and I'm sure she'll have even better points than mine. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you for pointing out that important historical site and a museum that, I haven't been there yet. I'm really eager to get there too. So I'm going to be planning my visit as well. Thank you for that, Gail. And yes, the level of surveillance is. Yeah, can I just point out too, I was dealing with, of course, the passes and the fugitive slave ads, but you find the surveillance too in personal correspondence. So you'll find letters where the slave owner is writing to their friends and saying, basically, heads up, my enslaved person has escaped. Can you please be on the lookout for them? And of course, lock them up and, they're constantly saying, lock them up in the workhouse or the jail so I can get them back, right? So you can trace this too in personal correspondence and business correspondence of the enslavers. Thanks, Gail.
Michelle?
Yes, hi. Hopefully I can be heard.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. And I reiterate what Gail has to say, in terms of the just complete lacking of any kind of education. Certainly in my time, I mean, the books, the school books that I remember belong in the category of atrocities themselves, to be honest. There was everything was so terrible. My question is similar to Gail's in that and forgive me, I couldn't get the link to work. I came in a little bit late. You may have talked about your research methods, but it seems to me, I'm a teacher educator, and often the problem is that teachers are waiting for someone to produce some kind of synoptic text from which to teach, when, in my view, what they should be doing is doing their own deep dive into the archives. And so just as, things that I might suggest to teachers whom I teach, grad education students, for example, what would be, kind of basic advice for them in terms of like, don't be waiting for somebody to come up with, some scholastic publishing something that'll be 10 years old by the time they get it. Where should they begin?
Oh, thank you so much for that, Michelle. Okay, so, all right, so here's the thing. I totally understand your point, and about wanting teachers to do some of the work on their own. But then I totally understand that I'm sure most teachers feel already overwhelmed by the work that they have. And here's the problem: if the teacher wants to teach on slavery in South Carolina, Haiti, Jamaica, Brazil, there's just a whole bunch of secondary sources, meaning books, journal articles, and book chapters at their disposal. No problem. They don't have to go to the archives. They just grab the book, right? Read it, and then they think, oh, how do I make this sensible for a grade 9 class? With Canadian slavery, of course, because there's less scholars doing the work, there's less secondary literature. Because, put frankly, not enough of us have been into the archive yet. And here's the thing: what this looks like is the ads that I'm showing you, for instance, for Nova Scotia and or Quebec. Typically, you find them for sure in the microfilm reels of those 18th and 19th century newspapers that have been deposited in provincial archives. And then some of them, of course, at the National Archives in Ottawa, and others might be at good university academic libraries, okay? But they're microfilm reels. Who has the time to go sit there and go through these reels? They're typically 3 to 5 page newspapers each, but you can see like the nature of what a newspaper looks like, of course. And back then there's no photography. So what you're looking for is you're just looking through text mostly, or if you're lucky, there's an icon in the corner of the fugitive slave ad, like a man in a profile pose running. So why am I saying this? This takes hours and hours and hours to do, right? The first time I tried to start to collect the Nova Scotia ads, I came out here for a month in the summer and lived here and just went daily to the Nova Scotia archives. Who has the time to do this? Professors who win grants, right? Or teachers who have a grant. Otherwise, who can do this, right? So what needs to happen then is we need to have more people employed who have the credentials and the expertise to teach this. And then we need to be able to train that next generation of scholars, not all of whom will go back into academia. Some of them, blessedly, will go into elementary school education, college, high school, etc. But to your point too, one of the things I'm trying to do at the Institute is to build an open access database where the types of ads and manuscripts I've shown you will just be freely available, open access, anybody who wants to go in and use it. But also those types of synopses to say, okay, this is what you're looking at, this is the relevance, right? But again, that takes money, right? So part of it is the Institute has existed since 2020. And to be frank with all of you, if anybody knows any rich people, I'm always fundraising because NASCA has been great in giving me the space and giving me the platform. But I have to go now and find the corporate donors, the individual rich people, right? The philanthropic donations or the grants, right? So the database hopefully is coming, but what does it take to build an appropriate database, a digital humanities database at this moment, right? It's going to take probably at least, $100,000 to do that properly. So this is like, I'm right there with you, Michelle. I want to make all that type of data available so that it's easy for the teachers and other educators to get their hands on it, to be able to adapt it to what they need to do with their students.
Thank you so very much. And just to say, I think we have people in the room who have friends who are rich people.
Oh, yay. So if anybody would like to talk, I'm willing to meet with anybody. Yeah, that would be great.
Charmaine, have you met Lynn Jones yet?
Yeah, she's wonderful. She's on my advisory board.
Good. Okay. Great.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Not for money, but for access to tons of data at any case. We've got Elle Jones up next.
Good afternoon, Dr. Nelson. It's so great to see you here. I don't have any rich friends. Sorry.
Oh, no. Okay. It's great to hear from you. Elle, how are you? That's great.
I wanted to ask you, it was so wonderful to hear the stories of Black women in this talk, because we know that so few slave narratives or even this work has really emancipated Black women from the archives. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about doing that work, particularly through a Black feminist perspective and as a Black woman yourself, just some of that process of finding women's stories in particular.
Thank you so much, Elle. It's great that you could come today. I really appreciate that. Okay, so Black women. All right. So something that Elle is gesturing to that maybe not everybody understands is that when you're, as a scholar, dealing with or anyone going back and looking at the fugitive slave ads, right away, there's a deficit of enslaved females escaping. Why? Because we understand that for the most part, they would not leave their own children or children in their care behind, and it would have been incredibly difficult to escape with a small child or a baby. So when you're studying fugitive slave ads, it's biased towards male resistance through flight right away. So I can tell you in the context of Quebec, which is under the British from 1760 forward, Frank Mackey's book, Done with Slavery, has, he did such a service for us studying Canadian slavery in that he has an appendix where he's transcribed all of the Quebec ads that he's found. 51 of them, I believe, were fugitive ads. Of those 51, I think there's 10 females. Okay, so, but of the 51, there's probably actually around like 45 people escaping because some people escape multiple times. But still, then we have like maybe a quarter or less of that population that are females. So to Elle's point, what's really, deeply moving for me in working on and studying, analyzing these enslaved female ancestors is that you can see in the nature of their escapes that there's trauma and specific types of violence going on, meaning sexual violence. And I ended my talk by saying, listen, we have to understand part of the unique horror of transatlantic slavery was its matrilineal order, so that rape and sexual violence was incentivized because enslavers understood, if I can get my enslaved female pregnant, I get wealthier because I own her and I own her child. It doesn't matter who the father was. The father could be a free white man. But that child, even though it's mixed race, is a slave, born a slave because she is a slave, and I own the child because I own her. So this incentivized rape and sexual violence. So I'll just point out two cases where you see this in the ads. One is an enslaved woman named Isabella or Belle, who we have fugitive ads for her back to back, about 6 weeks apart in the 1700s, in the 18th century in Quebec. And the first one she's fleeing in August, but what is the alarming for me and should be alarming for anybody reading it is that it says that she escaped with no shoes and stockings on. And this is extraordinarily rare. This is totally abnormal for enslaved people in a place like Canada or the American North not to have proper footwear, even in the summer. Shoelessness was a sign of enslavement in a place like Jamaica, because enslavers did not give shoe rations, okay? But in Canada, they're giving proper seasonal footwear all year round, okay? So when we see that Belle is fleeing with no shoes and stockings, we know that she's fleeing without a plan. She's the opposite of Chloe. And then sadly, we can determine that she was caught because, again, 6 weeks or so later, there's another ad. She's fleeing from the same butcher, George Hips. So, that with other information, there's about 4, I think, extant bills of sale for Isabella, where she's being exchanged by these different white male slavers across about 10 years, 4 times, not normal. So we have to think about the specific type of racial and racialized sexual violence to which she was subjected to as a so-called mixed race or mulatto woman, okay? And of course, mulatto or mulatto women had this other, is kind of this, how do I describe this? Because of white stereotypes of female beauty, there was an assumption that mulattas were prettier because they were closer to white femaleness. Okay, so they were subjected to specific types of racialized sexual violence. Okay, but of course, that doesn't mean that so-called fully Black or African-born enslaved women weren't victims of this. They were, or how does a mulatta or mulatto come to exist? Okay, but that's Belle. The other one is an ad for an enslaved woman named Bet, who is the only enslaved woman that we know of documented escaping in the winter in Quebec. There's 5 winter escapes by 3 people. And one of them is Bet escaping in March. And what's so, hard to process, and we think about the trauma that Bet is going through or was going through. She's escaping in March in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy. The ad describes her as big with child and within a few days of her time, I think, or a few weeks of her time, right? So you have to ask, what is going on in the household of the 2 merchants that owned her that forces her to think this is the best decision? This is my option. And tragically, we know that she survives, the child dies, and she's tried for murder. but there's trial transcript no longer exists. What we have is a non-guilty verdict. And then we have, again, about 6 to 8 weeks later, I believe, a sale ad, of course, anonymous. There's no name, Bet is not mentioned, but we know it's her because she was, I think, quadrilingual too, like Andrew. And the way she's described, we know it's the same merchants selling her off now, right? So she would have been seen as irresponsible. She would have been seen as a disobedient enslaved person. Whereas for us today, looking back, we're thinking, what were they doing to her for her to want to flee in the dead of a Quebec winter in March in her 3rd trimester? And we have to understand that one of those 2 merchants may have been the father of her unborn child, right? That's the nature and the ubiquity of sexual violence against enslaved women in the context of transatlantic slavery. Thank you so much for that question, Al.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. We're just so grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take one more question. We're at the end of our time. I'd like to call on Alexia Major.
Hello. Thank you very much, Dr. Nelson, for this, just all of the information, really. I just, not so much a question, but just definitely want to encourage you in the difficult work that you're doing, but it is ultimately good work. I'm from the Bahamas. I graduated from the mountain 2019, so I'm here now. But just to say that learning all of this, I've learned a lot of what you've said in stages and in pieces, certainly not to this extent, but education in the Bahamas does include slavery. And because of a lot of the high schools recognizing that Bahamian students will go to the US for school, there is a focus on the slavery there. So we learn about American history in that context. And I don't know if they do this intentionally to equip us with information with the context of where we're going, but also the proximity of the Bahamas to the US. But we learn about the transatlantic slave trade because that's where we are, right? Like we were the nexus point for a lot of this stuff. So, and Canada is like that one student you said, you know, they threw that line in there. It's kind of like, oh, well, by the way, yeah, this happened here too. But even, at least, I can't speak for the whole Caribbean on that, but there, at least from the education that I would have had, it was a by the way statement. And it wasn't until really a few years ago, I know this will sound weird, but for my birthday, my husband and I went to the museum down in Shelburne, and we spent the whole day there. So if anyone does plan to go, just budget the whole day. That would be the best thing to do. But yeah, so definitely as a permanent resident now, I'm learning, and thank you so much for this. But it is like I said, it's hard work, but it's good work. But everyone needs to be informed and understand the context that we're all operating in and trying to move forward in. So just really a thank you and encouragement to keep going.
Thank you, Alexia. And Alexia, what do you do? Are you a teacher by chance, or?
Oh no, maybe in another lifetime. That was the plan. But maybe someday. But for right now, I do my very, very best in the Center for Academic Advising and Student Success at the Mount.
Oh, fantastic. Congratulations. And thank you for those comments. And yes, it is interesting that there are even parts of the world that we assume there would be a rigorous education in transatlantic slavery, like Bahamas or Bermuda, where it's actually also being ignored or erased, actively so. And then just to point out, Canada is not alone in this. My students at McGill who are from the USA came into my classes not having a clue that slavery had transpired in the American North. So they were like, what are you talking about Massachusetts for? Why are you mentioning Pennsylvania, New York State? So the blind spot in the USA is the whole North. And then also, of course, Mexico. We never think about Mexico. So usually places that it wasn't a plantation system get erased. And of course, we have erased the fact that Denmark and Norway were one kingdom and were slaving and had colonized the islands of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, which were at one point called the Danish West Indies. Today, they're the U.S. Virgin Islands because they sold them about 200, I think, about 200 years ago or so. But yeah, there's a lot of other places besides Canada that are guilty of this historical amnesia that need to have some correctives and some repair and redress. But thank you all again for being here. Thank you so much, President Lumpkin, for your warm introduction and for your wonderful invitation.
And I want to add my thanks. Alexia really did a lovely job of thanking you on all our behalf. And I would just like to say, I hope you get a chance to meet her at some point. I was fortunate enough, shortly after she finished her English degree at the Mount, to hire her as a copy editor for a biography I had just finished writing. So she's multi-skilled, and I do hope you get a chance. We're very proud of her as a product of our English department at the Mount, along with much other. I'm sure much more went into creating the wonderful young woman she is, but I hope you get a chance to meet sometime. And I just, as I say, want to add my own thanks. It's been such a rich and full conversation, both your presentation and the questions that were brought forward to allow you to dig even deeper into the work that you're doing. I wish you luck in finding rich donors to speed it up. You're probably going to get lots of notes. Talk to somebody following today, but I'm sure you'll find the support you need for your work. This is so important.
Okay. And sorry, President Lumpkin, I'm just going to drop in there a link to the Institute so people can find us online. And we're having an African History Month panel on February 15th. I hope you can all join us. And you'll get to meet 3 of our fellows. Our first cohort was 5 people. So the 3 fall fellows will be on a panel together discussing the work that they generated during the fellowship. Thank you all so much. Thank you again.
And let's add thanks as well to the staff, to our colleagues at the research office, Jackie Hagan, Simone, and of course, always thanks to Patrick, our wonderful sound engineer and master of everything technological. So thanks to all who made this afternoon such a wonderful event. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.